the chair calls upon himself. Part of this is to discuss solutions. I can't help but notice that the solution is to take offshore revenue that's principally generated from the Western and Central Gulf and to spread it around the rest of the country. I feel a little bit like the turkey on Thanksgiving Day. And I say that because that cannibalizes the ability of Gulf Coast states to repair their coastlines. We've seen consequences of those coastlines being in disrepair. Hurricanes Katrina and Rita were great examples. And to the degree that we lose in Louisiana marshland, and we're losing an incredible amount, we've lost something more than the state of the state of Delaware, is the degree to which my cities become more vulnerable. Put simply, 1 mile of marshland takes a Cat 5 hurricane to a Cat 4, and the second mile to a Cat 3, and the third mile to a Cat 2. And to the degree that we have a Google map which shows green, and yet I know when I'm out there on a boat that that land is no longer there but rather has subsided, is a marker of the risk to my state. Now, I've expressed my objections to Senators Portman and Alexander that this resource, which although for 5 years it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand would be upped for another 5 and another 5 and another 5, ultimately impacts the ability of the Central Gulf to ask for additional resources to repair our coastline. So with that preamble, and wanting to help, I certainly want to help this deferred maintenance. I totally accept that. I'd like to first enter several letters into the record. I ask myself, and I thereby approve. The first is from October, signed by Senate colleagues from revenue-generating states along the Gulf Coast, asking for parity in terms of how we disperse energy revenues. This is to point out that on-land revenue sharing is far more generous to the states than it is for offshore revenue sharing. The second is a bipartisan letter to the President from governors of Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, which call for the same. And the final 2 letters are from 59 members of the Louisiana legislature and 15 parish presidents, which concerns echo those which I've just expressed. I also want to point out that Senator Hyde-Smith and I are working with our Gulf Coast colleagues on a proposal we hope to introduce soon to ensure Gulf interests are satisfied in this endeavor. Now, I say this because everybody's going to say, oh my gosh, Cassidy's being parochial. He's concerned about New Orleans getting whacked by a hurricane. He should be concerned about a campground on the Smoky Mountains. And I am concerned about that campground on the Smoky Mountains. But I'd also like to suggest, Mr. Cameron, I'll go to you. The committee notes that just 112 parks charge entrance fees, and 80% of those fees stay within the park where the fee is assessed. Active duty and disabled veterans do not pay entrance fees, and former Secretary Zinke shared with this committee that whole carloads of visitors can enter a park at no cost if they go in with active duty military or a disabled veteran. Theoretically, a school bus, and the driver is active duty, and then you'd have 40 kids enter without paying a fee. Now, if we really care about these parks, if we really want to have these fixed, would it be reasonable that the active duty would enter, but those in the bus would otherwise pay a fee?
Senator, I think you raised some interesting points. The administration has entertained making changes to our rec fee program over time in terms of how we charge and who we charge and where we charge. And frankly, we've gotten less than wild enthusiasm.
So my colleagues who are so eager to spend revenue from off the shore of the Gulf Coast, because by golly, it is such a priority to fix these parks, are less eager to actually have a user fee that's actually pretty modest that would apply to those using those parks?
We're pleased to have the authority that the Congress has given us up until now to charge user fees, and I'd hazard a guess that we would welcome a broader authority where.
So, do you currently have the ability, if you have a bus load of people who are not disabled or active duty, but the driver is, do you currently have the authority to charge the fees to everybody else except for that driver who would qualify?
I don't have the answer to that specific scenario.
Does anyone else know the answer to that? Because I think that is a kind of a key question. If we really care about this issue, we should consider user fees to apply to all those to whom they would ordinarily apply. And Mr. Pusker, do you know the answer to that?
In general, there are both the traditional recreation fees that I think you're speaking to, where the norm for, say, having an America the Beautiful pass should not go to a full bus load of people coming in. But yes, you're absolutely right, would be used by, say, a regular car with 4 people in it. Separate from that, though, I would note there are commercial fees that can, when you're talking about, say, a busload of people coming in for a special event, others, guides, outfitters, and others will work separately and on a different schedule with the land management agencies to pay appropriate fees.
But I gather that according to Zinke, there's a whole raft of people who are not paying appropriate fees because they are entering in under the umbrella, if you will, of somebody who Congress has given a pass to.
I think what the Public Lands Alliance would certainly agree with you that recreation fees have not been maximized in their current state.
I'm out of time, and although I'm the chair and I could indulge myself, I won't. I will point out, do I have a script, by the way? I will point out that I'm a little bit, what's the word? Less convinced about crocodile tears for our parks when people will not assess appropriate user fees on those using those parks to defray this expense. And it is money left on the table which I suspect those users would more than willingly pay. But it reminds me of an old Russell Long quote, don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the person behind the tree. And in this case, it is the Gulf Coast states, but the consequences, there's less money to rebuild my coastline, which means that I will continue to have the highest rate of erosion and land loss in the in the entire United States, and one of the highest in the world. Senator King, would you like a second round?
Well, I'd like to discuss what you raised, because the bill doesn't take funds away from coastal restoration. It specifically, the language is revenues due and payable to the United States from oil, gas, coal, and alternative and renewable energy development on federal land and water that would otherwise be credited, covered, or deposited as miscellaneous receipts under federal law. Then it goes on to talk about effects on other revenues. Nothing in this section affects the disposition of revenues due to the United States special funds, trust funds, or states for mineral and energy development on federal land and water have been otherwise appropriated under federal law, including Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, Mineral Leasing Act. In other words, we tried to avoid doing just what you suggest, and that is, these are excess funds, not funds we're not taking money away from any of the allocations to the states. These are funds that would otherwise simply go into the Treasury as unallocated funds. So we should pursue this discussion, because this isn't an either-or proposition. Additionally, I agree with you that fees have to be part of the equation, and there are places where there are no fees charged, and the people who use the parks, just as they do at many of the parks, should pay a fee, and I think the Park Service should be a little more active in thinking about that. Prior to your joining us today, we talked about other ways to augment these funds, and I should say that this bill only covers half the backlog, and we're going to be looking to other resources, whether it's matching funds or additional resources. So we're trying to work this out in such a way that it does not diminish. And as you know, I've been a strong supporter of your efforts to protect the Louisiana coast. I think it's tragic, and I've seen the charts that you've shown us of the loss of land. And so hopefully we can continue to work on this in such a way that will satisfy the interests of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast states, and also the people of the United States that are so interested in working on this backlog at the parks.
No, I appreciate that concern, but I will point out that if you're on federal lands in a land, then you get 51% of the royalties that derive from that well. But if you are on a coastal state, which currently is the Gulf Coast, but with your case may soon be wind, then royalty is capped at 37.5% with an overall cap, I'm looking at my staff to make sure I have this right, of $500 million. 500 million. And so whereas it's 51% here, it's 37.5% here with an upward cap. And so my concern is I'd like to have increased revenue for your state if there is wind being generated off your state, or for my state for the consequences of that offshore exploration. And right now I fear that this will cannibalize the ability to achieve that in the future, because now we have more and more money going out to this maintenance. But
Well, I think that's a discussion that we need to have, but I just wanted you to know that we weren't trying to take money from the offshore revenues that are so important to Louisiana.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The questions, I should also note that questions for the record will be received for 2 weeks after the end of this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for coming and for adding to our public discourse, and the hearing is now adjourned.